On the morning of June 11th, 323 BCE, in the royal palace of Babylon, the greatest conqueror in human history died without saying who should come next. Alexander the Great was 32 years old. He had built an empire stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River in roughly 13 years of continuous campaigning, the largest empire the Western world had ever seen. His generals surrounded the deathbed. The palace was filled with the finest military commanders of the age, men who had crossed the Hindu Kush and waded through the Punjab and stormed the walls of Tyre and Persepolis alongside him. When they asked who should inherit the empire, who should receive the ring, who should command the armies and control the treasury and govern the 60 satrapies they had collectively conquered, he reportedly said only this: to the strongest. Whether those were his actual last words or a later invention of the historical tradition, they were without question the most consequential final words in ancient history. Because what they produced was not a succession. What they produced was a 40-year war of all against all. A catastrophic, cascading series of conflicts in which the men who had marched beside Alexander and crossed deserts together and stormed the same walls and bled on the same battlefields took everything he had built and methodically, systematically destroyed it in the name of keeping anyone else from having it. The empire Alexander built was dismantled not by foreign conquerors, not by barbarian invasions, not by plague or famine or economic collapse. It was dismantled by his own generals, his own family, his own soldiers. By 281 BCE, 42 years after his death, every single one of his original successors was dead by violence or imprisonment or despair, and the empire had fractured permanently into 3 rival kingdoms that would spend the next 2 centuries fighting each other until Rome picked them off one by one. This is the story of how they did it. To understand the full scale of the catastrophe that followed, you have to understand precisely what Alexander had actually built and how completely improbable that achievement was. In 334 BCE, when Alexander crossed the Hellespont from Europe into Asia to begin his campaign against the Persian Achaemenid Empire, he was a 22-year-old king of Macedon, a relatively small kingdom on the northern fringe of the Greek world, commanding an army of perhaps 40,000 Macedonian and allied Greek soldiers. He was setting out to attack the most powerful state in the known world, an empire that had existed for 2 centuries, that controlled territory from the Aegean coast of modern Turkey to the Indus Valley in Pakistan, that commanded armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and that had the resources of an entire civilization behind it. What followed in the next 11 years was something that no one in the ancient world could have predicted, and that historians have been trying to explain ever since. Alexander defeated the Persian army 3 times in pitched battle: at the Granicus River in 334, at Ipsus in 333, and at Gaugamela in 331. Each time against forces that dramatically outnumbered his own. He conquered Egypt, where the priests of Amun recognized him as the son of the god, which he took seriously. He burned Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, in what may or may not have been a deliberate act. He marched his army through Bactria and Sogdiana, modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, in some of the most brutal campaign conditions in ancient military history, fighting a guerrilla war against a population that refused to submit. He crossed the Hindu Kush twice. He defeated the Indian king Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in what is now Pakistan in 326 BCE, a battle that required him to build a fleet and transport an army across a monsoon-swollen river in the face of elephants. And then his troops refused to go further east, and Alexander turned back. He marched his army through the Gedrosian desert on the return journey, in conditions that killed perhaps a quarter of his force. He arrived back in Babylon in 323 BCE and immediately began planning further campaigns. Arabia first, then possibly Carthage, possibly further west into the Mediterranean world that he had not yet touched. His empire at the moment of his death encompassed perhaps 2 million square miles and governed populations speaking dozens of languages, practicing dozens of religions. The captured Persian treasury at Persepolis and Susa and Ecbatana contained wealth so vast it had taken entire armies of oxen and mules and camels to transport it, estimated at 180,000 talents of silver, enough to fund wars for generations. He was 32 years old, and he was not done. What he had conspicuously failed to do was build any structure that could survive his own death. This is the deepest problem with Alexander's legacy, and it runs through every single disaster that followed. The Persian Empire that Alexander had conquered had been governed through a sophisticated, centuries-old bureaucratic system of satraps and royal secretaries and provincial treasurers, and the famous royal road network that connected the extremities of the empire to the center and allowed messages to travel from Susa to Sardis in a week. Alexander had largely preserved this system after conquest, installing Macedonians in the top positions while keeping Persian administrators in place below them, because he understood that you cannot actually govern conquered territory without local expertise. But the entire system still depended, at every level, on the personal authority and continuous presence of the king. When Philip II of Macedon had built the Kingdom of Macedon into the dominant power of Greece, he had done so partly by creating durable institutions. The reformed Macedonian phalanx, the companion cavalry, the systematic relationships with great noble families through marriage and patronage. Institutions that continued to function after his death because they served the idea of Macedonian kingship rather than the person of any individual king. Alexander had taken those institutions and weaponized them, but he had fundamentally abandoned the institutional approach to governance. He was not, in his own self-conception, the king of Macedon ruling an empire on behalf of the Macedonian state. He was a god-king in the tradition of the Egyptian pharaohs and the Persian great kings, a unique and irreplaceable individual whose authority was personal, absolute, and derived entirely from himself. When he was alive, this worked. It had worked brilliantly. The empire held together because Alexander held it together. When he died at 32, which no one had expected, because Alexander seemed to be the kind of person who would live forever or die gloriously on a battlefield, not waste away from fever in a Babylonian palace. That personal authority evaporated instantly. What remained was the territory, the army, the treasury, and 20 or 30 generals who were each perfectly capable of running the whole thing and each absolutely unwilling to take orders from any of the others. The scene in Babylon in the hours and days immediately after Alexander's death was barely controlled chaos. His senior officers gathered in the palace to decide what would happen, knowing that every decision they made in this room would determine the fate of the largest empire in the world. Two immediate factions emerged with startling speed. The infantry commanders, led by a general named Meleager, supported the claim of Philip Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother through one of Philip II's many marriages. Aridaeus was a real Arged, descended from the royal bloodline of Macedon, and he was physically present in Babylon, which mattered enormously to the common soldiers who could see him and touch him and confirm that he was real. The problem that everyone in the room privately acknowledged, but no one wanted to say too loudly, was that Aridaeus was mentally disabled. Possibly epileptic, certainly incapable of independent governance. He had been kept in the background throughout Alexander's reign precisely because he could not function as a ruling king. Against the Aridaeus faction stood the senior companion cavalry commanders, led by Perdiccas, who had been Alexander's second in command at the moment of death, and who had been handed Alexander's royal signet ring as a dying gesture. Perdiccas and his allies argued for waiting, for deferring any decision until after the birth of Roxane's child. Alexander had married the Bactrian noblewoman Roxane in 327 BCE after his conquest of her homeland, and she was now heavily pregnant. If she bore a son, that son would be a true Arged heir, the biological child of Alexander the Great. But Roxane had not given birth yet, and there was no guarantee the child would be male. For several days, perhaps as many as 5 or 6, Babylon teetered on the edge of open civil war between these two factions, with actual armed confrontations between infantry and cavalry units in the streets of the city. A compromise was eventually hammered out that satisfied no one and solved nothing. Philip III Aridaeus would be recognized as nominal co-king, with Perdiccas governing as regent in the name of the army, when Roxane gave birth to a boy, who received the name Alexander IV. The infant was added as the second co-king. The empire of Alexander the Great was now formally ruled by a mentally incapable adult and a newborn infant. Every general in Babylon understood exactly what this meant. Of all the generals in Babylon who immediately understood what the situation meant and began positioning accordingly, Ptolemy was perhaps the most clear-eyed and strategically intelligent. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, had been one of Alexander's closest personal friends since childhood. The son of a Macedonian nobleman, raised at the same court, trained in the same military tradition, present at every major campaign from the Granicus to the Hydaspes. He was smart, pragmatic, and possessed of an almost unique quality among the Diadochi. He understood his own limitations. He did not have Antigonus's grandiose vision of reunifying the entire empire, or Eumenes' idealism, or Demetrius's reckless brilliance. What he had was the ability to see clearly what was achievable and to pursue it with absolute consistency. From the moment of the Babylon settlement, Ptolemy made clear that he wanted Egypt, and specifically Egypt, nothing more and nothing less. He had recognized something about Egypt that the other generals had not yet fully processed. Egypt was almost uniquely defensible. It was surrounded on the west by the Libyan desert, on the east by the Sinai desert, on the north by the Mediterranean Sea, and its southern boundary was protected by the cataracts of the Nile that made river navigation from the south impossible. Any invader had to approach through one of two narrow corridors, the Sinai approach from the east or a landing on the Mediterranean coast, and both were easily defended. Egypt was also enormously wealthy. The Nile Delta produced agricultural surpluses that fed much of the Mediterranean world, and Egypt's position at the junction of Mediterranean and Red Sea trade routes made its port centers of international commerce. Once you held Egypt and its treasury, you could fund wars indefinitely while sitting behind your natural fortifications watching everyone else bleed. But Ptolemy went further than simply taking Egypt. He made a move so bold that it shocked even his contemporaries. When Alexander's body was being prepared for transport back to Macedonia, where the Argead kings were traditionally buried, Ptolemy arranged for the funeral cortege to be intercepted in Syria and redirected to Egypt. He had Alexander's body brought to Memphis first, and eventually installed in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded on the Egyptian coast during the original conquest, and that Ptolemy was in the process of transforming into the most spectacular city in the Mediterranean world. Possessing Alexander's body meant possessing Alexander's legitimacy. Any king who controlled the tomb of Alexander the Great could claim a special relationship with the conqueror's memory. It was an act of political theater so audacious that every other successor immediately understood what Ptolemy had done, and none of them ever forgot it. Perdiccas, the regent, could not ignore what Ptolemy had done. Ptolemy had stolen the most sacred object in the Macedonian world, had defied the regent's authority publicly, and had signaled clearly that he intended to govern Egypt as an independent ruler rather than as a subordinate administrator. For Perdiccas to allow this without response was to concede that the regent's authority meant nothing. So in 321 BCE, 2 years after Alexander's death, Perdiccas assembled the main army and invaded Egypt. The campaign was a catastrophe of the first order. His army attempted to cross the Nile, probably at a ford near Memphis, and was repulsed with severe losses. The Nile was running high. The crossing points were more difficult than his engineers had calculated, and Ptolemy's forces were well positioned to defend the far bank. Ancient sources describe soldiers drowning in the current and crocodiles taking those who fell into the water. Whether the crocodile detail is literal or embellishment, the military reality was plain. The Egyptian campaign had failed. And failure was exactly the signal that Perdiccas' own officers had been waiting for. 3 of his senior generals, Pton, Antigonus, and most significantly Seleucus, the commander of the elite companion cavalry, entered his tent in the night and murdered him. Perdiccas had been the most powerful man in Alexander's empire, the one who held the ring and commanded the main army and governed in the name of the kings. He had lasted exactly 2 years before his own subordinates killed him, and the logic was perfectly clear. He had overreached by invading Egypt, and in overreaching he had demonstrated that he was not, after all, strong enough to hold what he claimed. The system had no other mechanism for resolving disputes. The year 321 BCE was also marked by another death that had tremendous consequences. One that came not from assassination but from battle, and that removed from the game the one figure many historians believe might genuinely have been capable of holding the empire together. Craterus had been Alexander's most beloved senior general, a man of supreme military skill who was also known for treating the common Macedonian soldiers with respect and warmth, who was famous for wearing Macedonian rather than Persian clothing as a statement of his values, and who was widely seen by the rank and file as the closest thing to Alexander himself that any of his successors could claim to be. Perdiccas had sent Craterus to deal with Eumenes of Cardia, a general who had refused to accept the new post-Alexander settlement. Eumenes was a peculiar figure in every respect. Not Macedonian, but Greek, not a general by origin, but a secretary, the chief administrative officer who had served both Philip II and Alexander in the bureaucratic rather than the military role, who had learned to command armies later in his career. He was fighting, at this point, explicitly for the legitimacy of the royal family, for the rights of the infant Alexander IV in a way that none of the Macedonian generals were. At the Battle of the Hellespont in 321 BCE, Eumenes deployed his forces with tactical sophistication that surprised Craterus. In the confusion of cavalry combat, Craterus was thrown from his horse and trampled before anyone on the battlefield recognized who he was. When Eumenes discovered afterward that the man whose death he had caused was Craterus, he was reportedly devastated. He had not wanted this particular victory. With Craterus gone, the Macedonian military had lost its one figure of genuine, near-universal moral authority. After Perdiccas' murder in Egypt, the surviving generals convened what was essentially a war council at a place called Triparadissus in Syria in 320 BCE. Antipater, who had been governing Macedonia and Greece throughout all of Alexander's campaigns, holding the home base while Alexander went east, suppressing Greek revolts, managing the complex politics of the League of Corinth, took over as regent. He was 70 years old, universally respected, and his age paradoxically made him acceptable to generals who would have fought each other for the role had it gone to anyone younger and more threatening. The satrapies were redistributed again. The key beneficiary of this redistribution was Antigonus Monophthalmos, Antigonus the One-Eyed, who had lost his eye to a sling stone in battle decades earlier and wore the wound as a badge of military experience. Antigonus controlled the largest single military force in Asia, an army 3 or 4 times the size of any other successors, and he was confirmed in his holdings across Asia Minor and given the additional commission of hunting down and destroying Eumenes, who had retreated into the interior of Asia Minor and was refusing to accept the settlement. Seleucus received Babylon as his satrapy, the strategic heart of the entire Eastern Empire. The map of Alexander's world had shifted dramatically in 2 years. It would continue to shift for another 4 decades. Antipater died in 319 BCE, and in dying he made one of the most consequential and puzzling decisions of the entire successor period. Rather than passing the regency to his son Cassander, who had served alongside him, who expected to inherit, and who was watching from Macedonia with barely concealed impatience, Antipater chose an elderly general named Polyperchon to be regent. Polyperchon was not incompetent, but he was not distinguished either. He had fought in Alexander's campaigns, but had never been among the inner circle of commanders, had no great military victories to his name, and had no powerful personal following among the armies in Asia. Antipater's reasoning has been debated ever since. Perhaps he thought Cassander too dangerously ambitious. Perhaps there was some personal estrangement in the final years. Perhaps he simply prioritized keeping the regency in the hands of the older generation. Whatever his reasoning, the result was explosive. Cassander immediately refused to accept his father's decision. He formed alliances with Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy, making clear that he intended to fight for Macedonia. Polyperchon, suddenly facing a coalition of the strongest military forces in the Western Empire, made a desperate gamble. He invited Olympias back into Macedonia. This was either the most politically audacious move of the decade or the most catastrophic error of judgment, depending on your perspective. Olympias, Alexander's mother, born a princess of Epirus, who had been Philip II's most formidable wife in a court full of formidable women, had spent the years since Alexander's death in a kind of frustrated exile. She had been in Epirus, the kingdom to the west of Macedonia, technically respected as the mother of the world conqueror, but practically excluded from any real political role by Antipater, who had disliked and distrusted her throughout Alexander's campaigns, and who was not about to allow her to interfere in Macedonian affairs. She and Antipater had exchanged letters of mutual denunciation that Alexander himself had been obliged to mediate. Now, in 317 BCE, Polyperchon needed her, needed the authority her name commanded, needed the legitimacy she carried as the grandmother of Alexander IV, needed the troops she could bring from Epirus. Olympias had waited 7 years for this moment. She came back with an army, and what followed was one of the most spectacular and ruthless displays of political violence in the entire period. Philip III Aridaeus, the co-king who had been under the control of his ambitious and capable wife Eurydice. Eurydice had been maneuvering to govern through her incapable husband and had been conducting a kind of shadow regency, was captured along with Eurydice. Olympias had Aridaeus executed. She had Eurydice executed. She had dozens of Cassander's allies and supporters in Macedonia killed, in some cases personally overseeing the executions. The irony was almost unbearable. The woman who was most passionately dedicated to protecting the Argead dynasty, who had devoted decades of her life to ensuring that Alexander's bloodline would rule, had just personally eliminated the last adult male Argead heir other than the child Alexander IV. Cassander moved in response with military efficiency. He marched from Cassander's bases in the south, besieged Olympias in the city of Pydna on the Macedonian coast, and eventually forced her surrender in 316 BCE. Even then, the execution was not straightforward. Cassander's own Macedonian soldiers refused to carry out the order when he gave it because she was Alexander's mother, and the Macedonian troops still felt the weight of that relationship even after everything she had done. Cassander had to arrange for the relatives of the men she had executed to do the killing themselves. It was a careful political construction designed to diffuse the moral responsibility for the act. If the executioners were the bereaved families of her victims, then their action could be presented as justice rather than political murder. Olympias died in 316 BCE. With her died the last person who had fought for the principle that Alexander's empire should survive as a unified political entity governed by Alexander's bloodline. Whatever else might be said about Olympias, and there is much that might be said, because she was brutal and vindictive and politically reckless even by the standards of a brutal and politically reckless age. She had believed in something beyond her own power. She had believed in Alexander IV and in the Argead inheritance. That belief died with her. In the eastern reaches of the former empire, Eumenes of Cardia was conducting a war of survival that stands as one of the most remarkable military achievements of the entire period. Antigonus had been hunting him for 3 years with the full resources of the largest army in the successor world, and Eumenes had evaded him, outmaneuvered him, and on several occasions defeated his subordinates in the field. Eumenes had done all of this while commanding the Silver Shields, the Argyraspides, the most fearsome infantry force in the Successor Wars. The Silver Shields were veterans of Alexander's entire campaign, men who had been at the Granicus and at Ipsus and at Gaugamela, who had stormed the walls of Tyre, who had crossed the Hindu Kush, who had fought Porus's elephants at the Hydaspes. The youngest of them were 40 years old. Many were 50 or 60, with 30 years of campaign service behind them. They were technically brilliant, ferociously proud, and they treated Eumenes with genuine loyalty. Not because he was Macedonian, which he was not, but because he was the best commander they had and because he consistently won. The problem was that for all their military excellence, the Silver Shields were soldiers in the most complete and least admirable sense. They had spent 30 years accumulating loot, and their loot, their wives, their children, their treasure accumulated over 3 decades of the most successful military campaign in ancient history, was traveling with the army in a baggage train. When Antigonus, in 316 BCE, managed to capture that baggage train, the calculation changed instantly. Antigonus sent a message to the Silver Shields, "Give me Eumenes, and you get your baggage back." The Silver Shields delivered Eumenes to Antigonus that same day, without hesitation and without apparent guilt. Eumenes was executed in 316 BCE. The manner of his death sources debate, but he was certainly dead by the end of the year. The man who had been the most principled defender of Alexander's unified empire, the only general fighting for the idea rather than for personal advantage, died because the veterans of Alexander's greatest army valued their accumulated property more than their loyalty to the man who commanded them. It was a deeply Macedonian ending. By 316 BCE, the landscape of the successor world had been dramatically simplified. Of the major figures who had divided the empire in 323 BCE, the following were dead: Perdiccas, Craterus, and Antipater from the regent/senior leadership, Philip III Arid Aridaeus, the co-king, Olympias, Alexander's mother, and Eumenes, the most principled voice for unity. The survivors were 5: Antigonus, the most militarily powerful, controlling most of Asia Minor, Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Babylon, Lysimachus in Thrace, and Cassander in Macedonia. And Cassander now took the step that was perhaps the most consequential single act of the entire period. He imprisoned Alexander IV and his mother Roxane in the fortress of Amphipolis, a strategic city on the Macedonian coast. They were technically still recognized as king and queen mother. The fiction of legitimate kingship was maintained for political reasons, but they were prisoners, visible to no one, accessible to no one, kept alive only as long as Cassander found it politically useful to have them alive, around 310 or 309 BCE. Ancient sources are somewhat imprecise on the exact date. Cassander had both of them murdered. Alexander IV was approximately 13 or 14 years old. Roxane was perhaps 30. With their deaths, the Argead dynasty, the royal house that had ruled Macedon since the 7th century BCE, that had produced Philip II and the greatest conqueror in ancient history, simply ceased to exist. There was no public announcement, no ceremony of mourning, no acknowledged succession. The murders were kept secret for some time, and when they eventually became known, no one responded in any way that could be called consequences. The dynasty of Philip and Alexander ended in a dungeon, killed by a man who had calculated that live heirs were more dangerous than dead ones, and he was probably right. The murder of Alexander IV removed the last reason for maintaining the fiction that held the successor world together. Since 323 BCE, all of the generals had at least nominally governed as representatives of the legitimate Argead kings. Their authority derived, formally, from the fact that they administered territories on behalf of the royal house. Now the royal house was extinct. There was no longer any theoretical basis for any of them to claim superior authority over the others. The pretense was finished. In 306 BCE, Antigonus and his son Demetrius, who had just won a spectacular naval victory against Ptolemies' fleet at the Battle of Salamis off the coast of Cyprus, took the decisive step. They both proclaimed themselves kings, not governors, not regents, not administrators. Kings, basileus, the royal title with all its implications of sovereignty. Within months, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander had all done exactly the same. There were now 5 kings where there had been one empire. The formal fragmentation that had been occurring in practice for 17 years was now official and acknowledged. Alexander's world had become kingdoms plural, and the only question remaining was which of those kingdoms would survive the process of mutual elimination that would inevitably follow. Demetrius Poliorcetes, the besieger of cities, deserves particular attention because he embodies, more completely than any other figure of the period, both the brilliance and the fundamental inadequacy of everything the Diadochi brought to the problem of empire building. He was, by any measure, the most spectacular military talent of his generation. His siege engineering was revolutionary. At the Siege of Rhodes in 305 to 304 BCE, he designed and deployed the Helepolis. City Taker, a siege tower 9 stories tall, 45 meters high, constructed of iron-plated timber, mounted on wheels and moved by thousands of workers, equipped with catapults and ballistae on every level. It was the largest siege engine ever constructed in the ancient world, and even though it ultimately failed to take Rhodes, the Rhodians sold the Helepolis for scrap after the siege was lifted and used the proceeds to commission the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It demonstrated a level of military engineering ambition that no other commander of the period could match. Demetrius won brilliant victories against opponents who should have defeated him. He was personally courageous in a way that sometimes crossed into recklessness. He was also, in every other dimension of leadership, a catastrophe. He dressed himself in purple and cloth of gold and wore a double diadem and conducted himself in public like a divine figure from mythology rather than a political leader who needed to manage institutions and relationships and supply chains and tax revenues. He showed no consistent interest in administration. He could conquer cities faster than anyone alive and then immediately begin losing them through neglect and bad governance. His personal life was legendarily extravagant in ways that his treasury could not support. He was the successor who most perfectly replicated Alexander's military genius while completely failing to replicate any of Alexander's other capacities. His father, Antigonus, who had the strategic vision and the territorial base and the military resources that might genuinely have allowed a reunification of the empire, died at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE at the age of 81, still fighting on horseback, killed by a thrown javelin. Demetrius, who had performed brilliantly on his wing of the battle, returned from his successful cavalry charge to find the center collapsed, his father dead, and the campaign irretrievably lost. He escaped with a remnant force. But Ipsus killed the last serious possibility of reunification under any single ruler. What followed Ipsus was a period of roughly 20 years in which the surviving successors spent most of their energy fighting each other while the pretense of any unified system dissolved entirely. Seleucus had become, by this point, the most powerful single figure in the successor world. His trajectory had been extraordinary. He had been one of the officers who murdered Perdiccas in 321 BCE, had received Babylon as his satrapy at Triparadisus, had then been driven out of Babylon by Antigonus in 316 BCE, had fled to Ptolemy in Egypt, and had then, in one of the most remarkable reversals in ancient history, retaken Babylon in 312 BCE with a small force of about 800 infantry and 200 cavalry, using speed and tactical surprise against an Antigonid garrison that vastly outnumbered him. The retaking of Babylon in 312 BCE became so important in the Seleucid tradition that it was later treated as the founding moment of the Seleucid kingdom. Year 1 of the Seleucid era, a calendar system that remained in use in parts of the Middle East for centuries afterward. From that base, Seleucus had systematically built the largest empire of the successor period, stretching from Syria and the Levantine coast through Mesopotamia and Persia and Bactria deep into Central Asia. He had even reached a negotiated settlement with the Mauryan Empire of India, giving up the eastern territories beyond the Hindu Kush in exchange for 500 war elephants, which proved to be one of the most strategically valuable bargains in the period. With those elephants, deployed at Ipsus, he and Lysimachus had killed Antigonus. Now only Lysimachus stood between him and complete dominance of the successor world. In 281 BCE, the two armies met at Corupedium in Lydia. Lysimachus was killed in the battle. Ancient sources suggest he was killed by a javelin wound, though details are sparse. Seleucus was now the last surviving member of Alexander's original officer corps. He was approximately 77 years old. He crossed into Europe, apparently intending to claim Macedonia, and perhaps finally achieve what had eluded every successor since 323 BCE, something approaching a unified empire. He never got the chance to try. Ptolemy Ceraunus, a son of Ptolemy I who had been expelled from Egypt when a younger brother was chosen as successor, and who had been serving at Seleucus's court as a refugee, assassinated him within weeks of his landing in Europe. In a single year, both of the last surviving original Diadochi were dead, Lysimachus in battle, Seleucus from a knife wielded by a man he was sheltering. The generation that had known Alexander personally, that had fought beside him and drunk beside him and argued with him about the nature of the divine and the limits of the possible, was gone. The three kingdoms that remained were genuinely stable in their own terms, but they were the permanent wreckage of what Alexander had built rather than its continuation. Ptolemaic Egypt was the most successful of the three, and in many ways the most extraordinary. Ptolemy I Soter had died peacefully in 283 BCE at the age of approximately 84, having made two decisions that set his dynasty apart from all the others. The first was his decision, made at the very beginning, to focus on Egypt and Egypt alone, to build there rather than to constantly reach for more. The second was the Library of Alexandria, not Ptolemy's invention exactly, but nurtured under his patronage and expanded magnificently by his son and grandson. The library and the connected research institution called the Mouseion became the greatest concentration of scholarly knowledge in the ancient world. Scholars were paid by the Ptolemaic state to live in Alexandria and conduct research, and the library's collectors actively sought to acquire copies of every text in the known world, by some accounts intercepting ships in the harbor and copying their books before returning them. By the time of its maximum development, the library may have contained 700,000 scrolls, effectively every text produced by Greek and Eastern civilization up to that point. Euclid worked in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth in Alexandria accurately to within a few percent, using the difference in shadow angles between Alexandria and Aswan at noon on the summer solstice. Archimedes may have studied there. The lighthouse of Pharos, rising perhaps 130 meters above the harbor entrance, became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and guided ships into Alexandria's harbor for centuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty that Ptolemy I founded would rule Egypt until the death of Cleopatra VA in 30 BCE, nearly 300 years, making it by far the most durable product of the entire Diadochi period. The Seleucid Empire was the largest but the least stable of the successor states. At its maximum extent under Seleucus I and his son Antiochus I, it stretched from the Mediterranean coast of Syria through Mesopotamia and Persia and Bactria into Central Asia, a territory comparable in size to Alexander's Eastern Empire, covering perhaps 2.5 million square miles. But this was too large, too diverse, and too thinly administered to hold together against the centrifugal forces that inevitably developed. The eastern territories were the first to fracture. Bactria, the Greek kingdom that had been established in modern northern Afghanistan, broke away under its own governors in the mid-3rd century BCE and became an independent kingdom that lasted surprisingly long, producing a remarkable hybrid Hellenistic Indian civilization that left extraordinary artistic artifacts before finally being overrun by nomadic migrations in the 2nd century. Parthia, the territory of modern northeastern Iran, similarly broke away. The Seleucid core. Syria and the Fertile Crescent and parts of Asia Minor became a perpetual battlefield between Seleucid forces and Ptolemaic forces fighting the Syrian Wars, a series of conflicts that spanned most of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. The Seleucid Empire was progressively reduced by these losses until only the Syrian territories remained, and those were absorbed by the Roman general Pompey in 63 BCE when he reorganized the eastern Mediterranean after defeating Mithridates of Pontus. Antigonid Macedon had the most direct institutional continuity with the original Macedonian kingdom, but it was Macedon, not an empire. After Demetrius Poliorcetes failed spectacularly as king of Macedon, he was so unpopular, so extravagant, so impossible to govern that his own army deserted him, and he eventually surrendered to Seleucus and drank himself to death in captivity in 283 BCE. His son Antigonus II Gonatas spent years fighting to establish control over Macedonia before finally succeeding in the 270 BCE after a Gallic invasion from the north that devastated the country, but which Antigonus eventually repelled at the Battle of Lysimachia in 277. Antigonus II Gonatas was, unlike his father, an effective and thoughtful ruler who patronized Stoic philosophy and governed with genuine competence. But the kingdom he governed was Macedon, a regional Balkan power, perpetually threatened by its neighbors, constantly intervening in Greek affairs without ever establishing stable control over them. The Antigonid dynasty ended in 168 BCE when the Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus defeated the last Macedonian king Perseus at the Battle of Pydna, the same city where Cassander had executed Olympias. Rome divided Macedonia into 4 separate republics. 35 years later, it was made a Roman province. The homeland of Philip II and Alexander the Great became one of the more routine possessions of the Mediterranean's new dominant power. What had happened in the 42 years between Alexander's death and the assassination of Seleucus is one of the most sustained exercises in collective self-destruction in the record of ancient civilization. The Diadochi were not incompetent men. They were, by any objective measure, among the most capable military commanders the ancient world ever produced. Ptolemy governed with such wisdom that his dynasty lasted nearly 3 centuries. Seleucus demonstrated organizational genius in building an empire across 2 million square miles. Antigonus came closer to reunifying Alexander's world than anyone else. Even Demetrius, for all his personal failings, displayed military and engineering brilliance that his contemporaries frankly acknowledged. These were not ordinary men who happened to inherit a great empire and then mismanaged it through stupidity. They were extraordinary men who destroyed an extraordinary empire because the structure of the situation they found themselves in made destruction essentially inevitable. Every one of them had been trained in the same military culture, educated in the same values, optimized for the same objectives: identify the enemy, concentrate force, achieve victory. They had all been trained by the same campaigns, in the same army, under the same commander who had insisted that the way to solve any problem was to march toward it aggressively and attack. When Alexander died and the problem to be solved was who would control the empire, they all applied the only approach they knew: attack. And when everyone attacked simultaneously, what they collectively produced was not a new Alexander but a 40-year war that consumed them all. The deepest lesson of the Diadochi is a lesson about the relationship between institutions and individuals, about what it means to build something that lasts versus building something that merely exists as long as you do. Alexander was, arguably, the greatest individual military and political talent in ancient history. But his empire was not built on institutions. It was built on him, on his charisma and his genius and his physical presence and the almost hypnotic effect he had on everyone who came into sustained contact with him. The empire worked because Alexander made it work, moment by moment, through the sheer force of his personality and capability. That is an extraordinary thing to achieve. It is also, structurally, a catastrophe waiting to happen, because extraordinary individuals die, and when they die, they leave no mechanism for what comes next. The Persian Empire that Alexander conquered had been governed for 2 centuries through institutions, through bureaucratic systems and administrative traditions, and established relationships between center and periphery. It survived multiple succession crises and several demonstrably bad kings because the system could absorb the failure of any individual. Alexander's empire had no such resilience. It was a performance, and when the performer stopped performing, the audience was left in a dark room arguing about who should turn the lights back on, and the argument became a war, and the war consumed them all. 3 generations after Alexander's death, the empire he had built in 13 years was gone. 3 kingdoms remained in its place, and they would eventually all fall to Rome, which understood something that Alexander never learned and the Diadochi never had the chance to learn, that the most durable thing you can build is not a conquering army or a treasury or a magnificent city, but a system of governance that outlasts the people who designed it. That is what Alexander failed to build, and in failing, he gave his heirs the opportunity to destroy what he had made, which they took eagerly, professionally, and with extraordinary thoroughness. The empire of Alexander the Great lasted from 323 BCE until approximately 301 BCE, 22 years, barely a generation, before it ceased to exist as any coherent whole. The kingdoms it produced lasted several more centuries, but they were not what anyone in that Babylonian palace on that June morning had imagined when they gathered around the deathbed of the greatest conqueror who had ever lived and heard the words to the strongest. What they had imagined was that one of them would be strongest, and that strongest one would inherit everything. What they discovered, across 4 decades of relentless war, was that none of them was strong enough to hold it all, and that in reaching for everything they had guaranteed that none of them would keep it. The empire Alexander built in 13 years was destroyed by his heirs in 3 generations, and the world that replaced it, fragmented, exhausted, gradually falling into Rome's shadow, never forgot what had been lost.